Hello and welcome to the Hometown Church Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jesse Roskamp. I'm your host, and I am joined by Pastor Brent Knox. Brent, how you doing today?
I am doing fine, thank you. And hey, here we are in the last installment of our Joshua series.
Yeah.
And it's been a good run, but today it's done. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about where this podcast goes from here on out. Is there going to be a little bit of a break or what?
Yeah, so there's probably going to be a little bit of a break. We've got a couple episodes that we're working on. My schedule is a little full at the moment with HSLT coming up and some other things for the summer. But we want to have a couple episodes that are really focused on mission and outreach as we prepare for MTOC. That's going to be coming up after this. We're working on preparing an Italy update from the mission trip that happened a couple months back. That's going to take a little bit of coordinating. It might take a couple weeks to get that ready, but that's where we're headed next.
Okay, but no weekly installments for a while.
Yeah.
And we're taking a break for the summer a little bit. But it's been good. I've had a grand time working on Joshua with you. And so the weekend teachers, they kind of zipped this last weekend from Joshua 8 all the way to Joshua chapter 24.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ground to cover. They went from Joshua 8 all the way to the end of the book. And there is stuff that happened in between.
A few things, yeah.
A few things that happened in between. And mostly a lot of conquering and dividing the land between the tribes. A lot of chapters seem fairly administrative, kind of a repetitive read. I can see why the teachers didn't really zero in on that because it would have been pretty dreary. Israel conquered this land, and then they conquered that land, and then some land was given to this tribe, and some land given to that tribe, and so on. And there were some administrative tasks of setting up the cities of refuge and setting up some Levitical cities. But there are some real nuggets that are buried in these chapters. And we're going to try to touch on some of those today. And I think we're going to try to back up also and review kind of the big story and how Joshua fits into everything.
Yeah. And this is probably a good spot to just kind of remind ourselves of the kind of overall structure of the book, because we kind of talked about right at the beginning of what Joshua was about, how it's laid out, how the story is laid out, as we kind of review what we've covered and where we're going today. But the first 5 chapters of Joshua are all kind of this building up of the person of Joshua, the leader of Joshua, taking over for Moses, and he's kind of replaying a lot of Moses's big events to establish him as that new leader for Israel. And then we transition from there into kind of the conquest of Canaan and all these battles. And there's some that go really well, there's some that go very poorly, and it's all determined based on their alignment with God. And their obedience to God. And it's kind of all hinges on this moment where Joshua encounters a figure called the commander of the Lord's army. And Joshua asks him, "Are you for us or are you against us?" And he says, "Neither," right? Like, I am the commander of the Lord's armies. The question is not, is God for us or is God against us, but are we for God? And so we see that play out through these battle scenes, and we get those kind of covered through chapters 6 through 12. After that, we get a long portion of scripture from, I believe it's chapters 13 to 22, which is all about the allotment of land, and Joshua dividing up the land based on the Lord's commands and giving it out to the people. And this is really the fulfillment of God's promise that he made to Abraham all the way back in Genesis, right, of giving him this land and it being given out to the 12 tribes, and then they're finally receiving this allotment. And we finish up with the final 2 chapters, and it's Joshua's kind of big send-off to the people. They haven't quite conquered all of the land. They've been given their portions, but there is still some work to be done, and he's calling them to be faithful. It's kind of his Deuteronomy moment, right, where Moses is calling the people to be faithful as they enter into this new era for themselves. And so Joshua kind of gets a similar send-off, and that was really at the focus of the message this last week. But how does Joshua fit into the bigger story of the Bible?
Yeah, so let's take a step back, because the book of Joshua is a piece of the bigger story. And we made this point on the very first podcast. So sometimes in our Bible reading, we get so focused on the little pieces, on the verses, the devotional verses that we read, that we write into our journals, and and all that's good. But the verses that we read, the chapters that we read, even the books of the Bible that we read, fit into a bigger picture. It's kind of like a little mosaic tile, and that mosaic tile itself might be pretty, but it fits into a bigger picture, and Joshua fits into a storyline. And what is that storyline? Well, the book of Joshua, as you mentioned, is the conquering of a land where Israel can settle, and that was an important piece of the promise that was made to Abraham. And in that land, Israel becomes a nation. Later on, in that land, the Messiah is born, and in that land, Jesus is revealed. In that land, Jesus is crucified and then rises from the dead, and in that land becomes the launching pad for the gospel to reach the world. So the conquering of that land is a big piece of the bringing out of the Messiah later on. But even more so, Joshua foreshadows Jesus in some very, pretty amazing ways. There's gospel themes that emerge from Joshua. For instance, both bear the same meaning. Joshua, Jesus, bear the same name, that Yahweh saves. Both lead God's people into promise and rest. Joshua is a great leader that people are followed. Jesus is the greater leader that conquers as well. And as we read through the book of Joshua, it's tempting to see ourselves in the person of Joshua, but it's probably even better to see ourselves in the people who are following Joshua. We need a leader. Those Israelites needed a leader to bring them into this promised land. We also need a leader. We have a better Joshua who leads us into our promised land. Joshua conquered the Canaanites, but Jesus conquered even more. He conquered sin and he conquered death. Both defeat the enemies of God's people, but Christ's victory over sin and death is even greater. But Joshua is not the Messiah, but he is a pattern pointing forward to Jesus. And so we see all these types and shadows of a Jesus yet to come, and gospel things that emanate. And we've touched on a number of those themes as we were going through the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's really good to remember that the Bible is telling one unified story that's all leading up to and pointing us to the person of Jesus. And even in these kind of Old Testament stories that feel very disconnected, that bring up a lot of like challenging moral questions, and through the history of how God is working, it's important to remember that all of it is trying to set up this story of Jesus and who he is and what he's coming to do. And I think that's really important to keep that in perspective, especially because I think we can tend to treat the Bible as like a good morality book, right? Of like, here's the things that you should do, here's the things that you shouldn't do. And sometimes it gets a little bit more muddy than that, because that's not what it's necessarily trying to do. It's trying to depict humanity in a realistic way and point us to the one who actually lived the perfect life, right? And lead us up into that. And so the book of Joshua is really hyper-focused on the faithfulness of God. And that's really what we've been focusing on in this sermon series, of how God is fulfilling his promises to these people, how he's showing his faithfulness through these stories and these wars and these battles. How does the book of Joshua celebrate God's faithfulness?
Well, in a number of ways, but the big one is it's a fulfillment of a promise that was made to Abraham. He said, I will give you the land of Canaan, God said to Abraham. Well, 600 years had passed between God's promises to Abraham and Israel crossing the Jordan into the land. And in those 600 years, there were a lot of ups and downs. There were a lot of crises. There was a lot of disobedience. There was a lot of human weakness. There was a lot of time that went by. And the big tension became, will God be faithful to his promises? And so this actually becomes, like you said, the big theme of Joshua, and it's stated succinctly in Joshua chapter 21, verse 43. It says this, So the Lord gave to Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he solemnly promised their ancestors. None of their enemies could stand against them, for the Lord helped them conquer all their enemies. Not a single one of all the good promises that the Lord had given to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Everything he had spoken came true. And that right there is the theme of Joshua. And we have a promise-making, promise-keeping God, and he's faithful. And just as he made promises to the ancestors of Israel, Abraham specifically, and came through with that, even though it took a long time, and even though it went through a lot of ups and downs, and it wasn't on certainly Abraham's timetable, God's given promises to us. He's going to be faithful to us. We may be weak. We may have ups and downs. It may take a long time. It might not be on our timetable, but God will be faithful to us as well.
Yeah, that's really good. So we have a lot to cover today. We're covering chapters 9 through 24. And so of course we've taken a look at how God has been faithful through those first 8 chapters. We're going to take a look at how God is faithful through these last 16 chapters today. And of course we're not going to be able to cover all of it, but we do want to cover a few kind of key moments throughout the story leading up to the end. And so we left off at chapter 8 and heading into chapter 9. The nations are all the different people groups of the Canaanites right there. They're starting to see the power of God, right? Israel just took down Jericho. They took down Ai, and they are thinking we need to do something about this. So they kind of start forming this alliance against the people of Israel. Like we gotta fight back. We gotta protect our homeland, and except for one people group called the Gibeonites, who form a different plan. Rather than allying themselves with the other nations, they see that God is working and that he is powerful. And so their plan is to not ally themselves with these nations, but rather to find a way to ally themselves with Israel. And so what they do is they kind of act like they're coming from a far distant land, right? They're not one of these Canaanites that they've been commanded to drive out. They get some old food, they get some old clothes to make themselves look all raggedy, and they come to the Israelites and say, hey, we want to partner alongside you guys. We want to join in with what you're doing. Don't worry about us. We're definitely not your neighbors that you're supposed to be driving out.
We're a long ways away. We're not your neighbor.
Yeah. And so the Israelites fall for it and they make a covenant with them to join them in on this, right? And the interesting thing, I think, is that this covenant gets honored and they are allowed to come in, even though they're using deception to do this. So it's a really interesting story, but just tell us a little bit about what this Gibeonite deception is and why it's significant.
Well, you told the story pretty good, but the real central verse here, I think, is in Joshua 9, verse 14. It says, so the Israelites examined their food, but they did not consult the Lord. Mm-hmm. And again, here's another interesting thing about the whole conquest of the promised land and the victories that the Lord gave and the victories that the Lord didn't give. Had nothing to do with how strong the enemies were. It had everything to do with internal mistakes or disobedience of the Israelites. And, I think this story, you mentioned that they kind of came off a victory of, they had Jericho and they came off victory of Ai. Maybe the Israelites were feeling pretty good about themselves. I don't know what, but it does illustrate how easy it is for us to subtly shift back to relying on ourselves. Mm-hmm. Rather than on God. And even wise leaders make foolish decisions when they stop seeking God. And, have you ever heard that phrase, success is a greater test than failure? Mm-hmm. And there's a couple proverbs that kind of get at that idea, the crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, and a man is tested by the praise he receives. Well, how are you tested by praise? Well, maybe because you start relying on yourself. You start thinking more of yourself than you ought to think. Another proverb says, give me neither poverty nor riches, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Well, what's the problem with having riches? Well, you're not dependent on the Lord anymore. And so here we have these Gibeonites approaching Joshua and the leaders with this deception, and they rely on their reason rather than relying on the Lord. They saw their old bread in their worn sandals. They heard a convincing story. They assumed that these men must be from far away when they were not. And what they heard and what they saw, probably, and what they smelled with their nose, all their conclusions seemed reasonable. But they forgot one thing. They forgot to consult the Lord. It actually makes me wonder how often I do that. That I just rely on my own reason, and that I don't depend on the Lord and rely on the Lord and seek the Lord. It's what's being exhibited here is a self-confidence without prayer. And I think one way that could give us a hint that whether we're falling into that is just how large our prayer life is. As our prayer life is small, we're probably doing a lot of relying on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And in this case, relying on self ended up to be a thorn in Israel's side.
Yeah.
So that's one big thing that stands out. And so what? We need to pray. We need to pray, especially before big decisions. We need to trust God's wisdom. And maybe that would even include when we're facing choices and situations that I don't rely on our own self, but we rely on God, but we also maybe rely on getting the counsel from other people before we make big decisions. Deception is real. There's a lot of deception from our spiritual enemy that's occurring in this world today. A lot is being thrown at us. And we got to recognize even our own enemy, the Satan, he's stronger than us. We're not going to be able to see through all his deceptions. We need God's help. And in this case, Joshua did not rely on God's help. But the second thing about this story, and you alluded to it, that's striking to me is the Israelites kept their word even though it was born of a mistake and it was costly. They kept their word to the Gibeonites because even though they made a mistake here, they realized integrity matters. You keep your word even when it hurts. And one of the big lessons of this book that we've been making over and over again is that God is faithful, right? He makes promises and he keeps them. And so we're to be that way too. We need to follow through in our commitments. We don't break our word, even if it's uncomfortable. And we let our yes be yes and our no be no, and follow through with our commitments. And that's exactly what the Israelites did here. Because they promised them something, even though it was born out of a deception, they needed to be people that kept their word, and they did.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see God upholds this covenant through generations. We see much later on, right? We see King Saul, who is another example of someone not consulting the Lord before he does things, right? Where he goes and tries to annihilate the Gibeonites years and years later. And then the Gibeonites come to David later on and are like, hey, we need justice for this. And David upholds that because of this covenant that was made with them so many years ago. And so we see even that is lasting long generations, long spans of time. And we see his faithfulness through all of that. But I think this story also just reminds me of a lot of other stories throughout the Old Testament of kind of similar situations. The first one that comes to mind is Jacob, right? Who receives the blessing from God, from his father Isaac, right? Through means of deception. But yet that blessing is honored and carried through. Jacob is the one who is renamed Israel, and his 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. But how did he get that blessing? Well, he stole it from his brother, right? He pretends to be his brother who's out trying to get some food for his dad, and he comes back in. He puts the hair on his arms to make him seem like it's his older brother Saul, and so Isaac takes his arm and feels it, and he's like, hey, you don't really sound like Esau, but your arms are hairy. So, and then he blesses him in that moment, and it's not retractable. He just gives him the blessing, and God honors that. And I think it just really highlights God's willingness to work with broken and flawed people, right? And to be partnered with humanity that is morally corrupt. I think the Bible often does not just offer like simple, clean-cut morality lessons, but it depicts the messiness of human society and the human condition realistically, which is a blend of good and bad, right? So it reminds me of stories like that. It reminds me of stories like Abraham, right? Who goes to Egypt. He actually does this multiple times, but he tells Pharaoh that like his wife is actually his sister, so that they won't kill him. And then God like is against Pharaoh, even though Abraham's the one lying in this situation. He's the one who is morally corrupt in this situation, but God has made a covenant and a promise and is faithful to Abraham. And so he's willing to work in these kind of morally ambiguous situations, which I just find really fascinating.
Really, too bad we're not going through the book of Judges, and then we'd really see that.
Yeah, and we really see some moral corruption in that book
that God kind of uses anyway.
Yeah,
right.
Maybe we'll do that one next year. That'd be fun. Yeah. Anything more on that before we continue on?
No, sir.
Okay, sweet. So after this whole thing happens, we kind of see this alliance of different kings and nations coming together to attack Israel, right? To stand against Israel. And we see Israel going to try to fight against them, right? And we get this battle story of Joshua. He's leading, and he says this prayer of like, God, just stop the sun in the sky. He said, sun stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, and the nation took vengeance on its enemies. Which is just a fascinating story, because the sun just stops in the sky, stays there for 2 days. And there's a lot to make of this. Like, what is going on there? Did the sun actually stop in the sky? Is this supposed to be some sort of symbolic representation of something else? But what's the deal with this story?
There has been a lot of debate on this particular story, mostly because it just seems so incredible that a sun would stop in the sky. And the more that you investigate and know about science, to have the sun stop in the sky, that's a big deal. What it means is that the Earth stops rotating. And so talk about an incredible miracle. And this is what makes this particular example objectionable, maybe discussable. People argue over it a little bit. Did the sun really stop in the sky? Well, listen, if God can, if he can create the whole world with the breath of his mouth, he can stop the earth rotating, but it's not just stopping the earth rotating. You know, at the equator, the earth is traveling when it rotates 1,000 miles per hour. Can you imagine just stopping that rotation? And if you just stopped it, oceans would surge, over continents. There'd be global tsunamis, winds would reach unimaginable speeds. There'd be temperature shifts, there'd be the collapse of the magnetic field. There'd be tectonic upheaval and worldwide earthquakes and volcanic activity. And if the rotation of the earth just stopped, so God's managing all that in some huge, amazing miracle. And God can manage all that. I mean, if God is God, he can do it. I don't even know why people question it. There are miracles all over the Bible. I'll tell you, though, which something amazes even me more about this whole story than God just stopping the rotation of the earth. It's that Joshua even thought of the request. It doesn't say that God told him to ask that. He thought of that himself. He's battling. He needs more time to win the battle. And I'll tell you, Jesse, I have never thought about asking God to lengthen my day when I've had too much to do in my to-do list.
I've thought about it.
You thought, not me. This was a big prayer.
Yeah.
It's an incredible prayer, and it's a prayer without precedence. And God listened to that prayer. And then it also says in the text there, and there's never been such a day that God listened to the prayer of a man.
Mm-hmm.
it stimulates me, motivates me to think, you know what? I need to ask big prayers too. I mean, if I got a God who's that big, and this was all up to Joshua, and he thought of this prayer himself, God listened to that prayer and helped him defeat the enemy that day. Why not? Why don't I ask God for big prayers too? And so God fought for Israel that day and allowed Joshua to complete the big plan that was going on in the book of Joshua anyway, to conquer the land. And so it's not just about an incredible miracle. God's fighting for his people. And like I said, there's been no day like it when the Lord fought for Israel. And God's demonstrating his faithfulness to his promise that we've been following. He's demonstrating it here with some incredible power.
Yeah. It makes me think of the passage in James 5:16 where it says the prayer of a righteous person is very powerful in its effect.
Well, there you go. That's a pretty good example of that.
I think it's a pretty good example of it. I think we can be like, oh, yeah, I mean, you can do a lot with prayer. Not many people think we can stop the sun with prayer, right? But it's not in our prayer that is doing it, is in the power of God. It's the one that we're praying to who is able to accomplish it. But yeah, there are a couple different views on it. Like, is this a literal, he stopped the sun in place, the earth stopped spinning, he's controlling all that? I think it's one of those questions where you can be like, well, yeah, God can do anything.
Right.
A couple other views are that it's like a symbolic thing. It's there's the kind of hybrid view that maybe there was some more like light refraction going on, that it wasn't a literal stopping in the sky, but God was refracting the light in a different way to make it look like that.
Those are all fantastical alternative views.
Yeah.
Probably born from, this is such a fantastic miracle. Could it possibly ever happened?
Right.
Well,
I think at the end of the day, like we don't have video camera footage of what's going on there. I think the point of the story remains the same no matter what interpretation you take. I think if we believe in the same God, that the God that created the universe, like it shouldn't be a question of whether or not he can do this.
Right.
Whether or not he did, and the interpretation of it, I think is kind of irrelevant to who he is in general, right?
That's right.
So as we kind of continue on to this story, we get a few more battles here and there. It kind of gives us more of a summary of some other things that are going on. But we see that the Israelites were commanded to completely conquer the land. And as they're dividing out the land, we get that verse where it says, like, God was faithful to uphold all of his promises. Not one of them failed, right? But we also see these kind of little peaks of incomplete obedience, and we see that the land doesn't actually get fully conquered.
Right.
Kind of as we continue through the story, through Joshua, but then immediately into Judges. But where do we see that, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah. So sprinkled in these chapters, as Israel was commanded to conquer the land, we see verses like Joshua 13, verse 13. It says, "But the Israelites failed to drive out the people of Geshur and Maacah. So they continue to live among the Israelites to this day." So that's one verse. Joshua 15, it says, "But the tribe of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites who lived in the city of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites lived there among the people of Judah to this day." And then later on, Joshua 16, "They did not drive the Canaanites out of Gezer. However, so the people of Gezer lived as slaves among the people of Ephraim to this day." And then Joshua 17, "But the descendants of Manasseh were unable to occupy these towns because the Canaanites were determined to stay in that region. Later, however, when the Israelites became strong enough, they forced the Canaanites to work as slaves, but they did not drive them out of the land." And then Joshua 18, Joshua asked the people, "How long are you going to wait before taking possession of the remaining land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you?" And so we begin to see a compromise, an incomplete obedience kind of being sprinkled along the way in these chapters. Now, the book of Joshua ends in victory, but there are these little warning signs, these little seeds of incomplete obedience that occur along the way. And this presence of the Canaanites that were kind of left there proved to be a future temptation. So you have this toleration, this incomplete obedience. It seems like such a small little thing to leave a few Canaanites here and there, which led to their association with them, and then led the Israelites to participate with them. And so they began to intermarry. Their kids began to intermarry with some of these Canaanites. And when they began to intermarry, they began to participate in their religious practices, which led to idolatry. And this led really then to the downfall of Israel that we begin to see completely come to fruition in the book of Judges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what this highlights is that God's promises are not without conditions, right? We see multiple like covenants and agreements between God and people throughout the book, but I think it's really interesting that one of the first covenants we see is the covenant between God and Abraham, right? And in that covenant, he builds the altar, and then he puts Abraham into a deep sleep, and so it's just God walking through. So that covenant and promise was it was made to Abraham, but it was all on God to uphold that one. And we see that like unbreaking covenant throughout, like he is faithful to this promise. And later with Jesus in the new covenant, we see a similar thing, right? Where it is God become human to make this new covenant in order to, because now the obedience aspect is on God. The faithfulness aspect is on God. He is the one holding this covenant in place. It's no longer contingent on our obedience with it. But then we see all of these other covenants that God makes with the people, you know, when he makes the covenant at Sinai, when they're renewing the covenant multiple times throughout the Old Testament, there's always these conditions of, if you remain faithful to me, you will receive these blessings. And so we see God being faithful in fulfilling his promises, but also handing them over to the consequences of their own actions when they are disobedient to these things, which I think is just really interesting. And Hebrews chapter 4 kind of touches on this a little bit, where he's talking about rest and this idea of entering into God's rest, that the generation before Joshua, they failed to enter God's rest because of their disobedience. And then he goes on to talk about Joshua in chapter 8. It says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. For the person who has entered his rest has rested from his own works, just as God did from his. Let us then make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience." So Jesus is the one who comes to provide the greater rest, the more complete rest that was promised at the beginning to Joshua. So I thought it was just like a really interesting connection that we see this kind of highlighted in the New Testament, commenting back on what's going on here in this greater new covenant, this new rest that we're able to enter in.
Yep. Good.
Yeah.
That's great.
Sweet. So as we kind of continue through the allotment of land, we're seeing all these different tribes getting their portion. We can read out all the different boundaries that they get for their division. But in there, we get the story of Caleb is highlighted, and he kind of gets his own special allotment of land. Why is his story highlighted?
Well, let me just say first that Caleb is the hero of every retired person. He says, "I'm 85 years old. I am as strong now as when Moses sent me on that journey." So, listen, I'm almost 70. I hope I can say that 15 years from now and to be vibrant and strong and continue to serve the Lord wholeheartedly when most people are taking their foot off the accelerator. So that's Caleb, pretty aggressive guy. And I want to read the Joshua 14 verses about Caleb here. It says, now, this is Caleb speaking, "Now as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise." We're going to get to that in a moment because there was a very specific promise made 45 years earlier. So this is a little bit of another microcosm demonstrating God's faithfulness. There was a promise made to Caleb and to Joshua, the two guys that were the two spies that had faith on going into the promised land, and so there was a promise that was made to Caleb. Now this is his moment. to see that promise realized. Today, I am 85 years old. I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord has promised me. You will remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak living there and in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land, just as the Lord said. So why now is Caleb being highlighted in the middle of the book of Joshua? Well, I think it's because he embodies the very thing that the rest of the Israelites failed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Wholehearted obedience. Caleb takes a very hard task. He's the one who wholeheartedly followed the Lord. He's the one that decided to go after the strongest enemy in the hardest land, and he drives them out completely. But as we just got done talking about, many of the tribes of Israel would not drive out or did not drive out the descendants completely. And Caleb becomes the model that Israel should have followed. And he shows it in a secondary sense that age does not limit wholehearted obedience and courage. And like I mentioned, he's showing God's faithfulness. So decades later, 45 years later, God is keeping his word, and he keeps his word to those who trust him fully. And Caleb is exhibit A.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really cool to see how one person's like just steadfast faithfulness. I am going to be completely devoted to the Lord is honored and blessed because of that, right? Like he gets to see tangible blessings from God for being totally obedient and bought in to his promises and saying, I'm going to step out in faith and respond to this.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's in that chapter. Another version says that Caleb was a man of a different spirit. I think that's an interesting. That's interesting. The literal translation there, a different spirit, and that the Lord is trying to make a contrast between his obedience and following wholeheartedly the Lord and Israel's.
Yeah. I always thought it was interesting because we see it was Joshua and Caleb were the two spies that gave the good report of the land initially, right? But Caleb was kind of highlighted as the main guy, right, in that story. And then we see that here. I always thought it was interesting that Joshua was then chosen as the one to succeed Moses instead of Caleb. I don't fully have a thought on that of why, but I just thought it was interesting that Caleb is the one who's kind of promoted as that guy, but Joshua is the one chosen to succeed him. But it's kind of a side thought.
Ask God when you see him.
But kind of moving along here as we get this the allotment of land, it's all being handed out. But before all of this, there's kind of an interesting story as they're coming into the land. There were 2.5 tribes, the Reubenites and the Gadites, and then half the tribe of Manasseh. Before they entered the land, they're sitting on the other side of the Jordan. This is all in Numbers, all right? And they're looking at their land and they're like, hey, this looks pretty good. What if we just took this instead? And it's a really interesting story. And they bring it to Moses, and Moses brings it to God, and God's like, okay, yeah, you can have this land. This land will be for you. But on the condition that you go in with the rest of the nation, you drive out the Canaanites, and once the wars have stopped, you go back to your land, you can have this spot. And so we kind of see that play out here as the wars are starting to wrap up. Joshua sends the eastern tribes back, but there's a little bit of a conflict that arises because of this. What were the obstacles that Israel faced when the eastern tribes returned home?
Well, they returned home and they built an altar, or at least what the Israelites assumed was an altar. They built maybe it was a pile of stones or something. There were stones being piled all over in the book of Joshua for various reasons. And they built it under good motives to remind people on their association with the Israelites. But the Israelites, on the other side, made an assumption that they were building an altar to the Lord so they wouldn't have to return back to Jerusalem. And of course, that was in violation of the law under Moses. and because they assumed that this is what they're doing, the Israelites prepared for a civil war. They immediately assumed that they have rebelled against the Lord, so we've got to take these people out. And fortunately, some more cool-headed people prevailed, and Phineas, I believe, was it Phineas? Yeah. They slowed down. They sent Phineas and a delegation to talk with those eastern tribes to find out exactly what they were up to and what they did. And the eastern tribes said, "Hey, no, that's not what we were intending at all." And it's an interesting thing to me. There's a verse in Proverbs 13, verse 10. It says in the New American Standard, it says this: "Through presumption comes nothing but strife, but with those who receive counsel is wisdom." They almost had a civil war because of presumption. And I think about that in our own relationships with people. There's a lot of fighting that comes in relationships because we jump to conclusions and assume the worst rather than believing the best. Sometimes I even do this. I create scenarios in my head about a person based on a small comment or based on someone's interpretation of an event. And I don't go and talk to the person myself. Gossip, especially when we listen to gossip, especially does that. It creates scenarios and presumptions in our head. And I think this whole story helps illustrate for us that we just need to slow down. We need to be slow to be making judgments and coming to conclusions, and not making judgments based on appearance or hearsay or gossip, that we should only come to conclusions based on facts. We think we know what we know, but we don't really know. And all this destroys relationships, and it almost was a tragedy here. But fortunately, Israel does slow down and sends Phineas and a delegation to talk, and they were able to resolve this through a honest conversation. And once the eastern tribes explain their motives, the tension disappears immediately. And then Phineas responds, "Today we know that the Lord is in our midst."
Yeah, I think this whole situation, and really just kind of the story of the eastern tribes, is really interesting. And I think it tells us a lot about conflict and how we go about certain things. But I think the thing that's really interesting to me is that the eastern tribes, they chose not to enter the promised land, right? They chose not to take their inheritance there, but they settled for their inheritance on the opposite side of the river. And God grants that request, right? He allows them to do that. But this is a decision that has consequences. Like it results immediately in conflict with the other tribes. And we see much later in Israel's history, they're the first tribes to get conquered, right? Because there is this tangible separation now between them and the rest of the nation of Israel. They're left vulnerable. And I think this is just really, really applicable to us now, right? Because I think there's times where God has something better for us, but we settle for something less. Like we say, actually, I don't want to go all the way over there. I think this route is better for me. And God will say, okay, I'll let you stay in that position, even if it's not the best situation for you. He'll honor that and he'll give that to you. But there is something better, and he's calling you into something better. And I think about this with like church relationships too, right? I think there's a lot of times where people will come to church, but they don't want to invest all the way. So they kind of keep themselves on the outside and saying, I'm going to keep myself at a little bit of a distance because I think this is safer for me. But really what it does is it creates vulnerability for yourself, because now you're separated from the rest of the church. And now those relationships aren't as close, and it can create conflict because now there's that separation. So I just think their whole story is really
interesting meditation.
Yeah, it's just a really fascinating story.
It is.
Yeah. So as we get kind of towards the end of the book here, we're left off with these last two chapters, which are Joshua's final words to Israel, right, where he's renewing the covenant. What do we learn from these last couple chapters?
Well, we got chapter 23, and this is Joshua's farewell message. Let's call it his retirement party or something. And he's got this message that he wants to share with Israel. starts in verse 1. It says this: the years passed, and the Lord had given the people of Israel rest from all their enemies. Joshua, who was now very old, called together all the elders, leaders, judges, and officers of Israel. He said to them, I am now a very old man. And he's passing on to them his very last words, the very things that he wants them to remember. And I think there's several key points with this last message. He says in verse 3, he says, you have seen all that the Lord your God has done. You've seen that the Lord your God has fought for you. And I think what he's saying here is, don't forget God's faithfulness. You've seen all that God has done. And obedience grows out of our remembering God's faithfulness. Forgetfulness, if you forget what God has done, then it leads to drifting. And unfortunately, we'll see later on, Israel does forget.
Yeah.
And they do begin to drift. And I think Joshua knows this, and he's telling him, remember God's faithfulness. Then he says, keep taking possession. There's work, there's fighting still yet to be done. And he's reminding them that their battles aren't over. The kingdom has yet to expand. And I think that applies to us. We are still aliens and strangers in this world, and we're a part of a kingdom that's an expanding kingdom. Let's enter into the battle. Let's not get lazy. Let's keep working. Joshua goes on to tell them, he says, so be very careful to obey or to follow everything Moses wrote in the book of instruction. Do not deviate from it, turning either to the right or the left. And now he's echoing back what he told the Israelites at the very beginning. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Mm-hmm. We need to be devoted to the word. And spiritual drift is what's natural, but being devoted to the word and obeying the word, well, that's intentional. And then he warns them, don't associate with these nations. Don't intermarry with them. And he's warning them about their relationships. Our relationships shape our loyalties, and they begin to compromise because of associating with the Canaanites that were in their land. And he tells them, don't associate with them, don't intermarry with them. Who you hang out with affects you. And then he says, rather cling tightly to the Lord your God as you have done until now. And he's reminding them, you've got to have a strong relationship with God. And that Hebrew word cling means to stick or to hold fast or to be glued to. If we're going to remain faithful to God over the long run, we have to be deeply attached to the Lord. And then he says, so be very careful to love the Lord your God. And if we love God, he's going to expand his kingdom through us. And he gives an interesting promise to them. It says, each of you will put to flight 1,000. So God, he wants to supernaturally work through our life, but we got to cling to the Lord, love the Lord, obey the Lord. And then he says, soon I will die, going to the way of everything on earth. Deep in your hearts, you know that every promise of the Lord your God has come true. Not a single one of them has failed. And so God's promises are certain. God's faithful. He's faithful both to his blessings, and he's going to be faithful to the consequences of disobedience. And so he says, but as surely as the Lord your God has given you the good things he has promised, he will also bring disaster on you if you disobey him. He will completely destroy you from this good land he has given you. So God, he's telling him God's going to be faithful both in his blessing and his discipline. And then we come to the last chapter. And Joshua reviews the history of Israel. And this is the first part of this chapter up to this point. And then he reminds them. In verse 12, he says, it is not your swords or bows that brought you this victory. I gave you land that you've not worked on, and I gave you towns that you did not build, the towns where you are now living. I gave you vineyards and olive groves for food, even though you did not plant them. And he's reminding them of God's grace.
Mm.
God gave them so much, that undeserved people, just like he has given us. And he's given us every spiritual blessing that we're in Christ. And so just as Paul in Ephesians 1 was reminding us of all of God's grace and blessing, Joshua was reminding them too. And then he says, because of that grace, he says in verse 14, so fear the Lord then, serve him wholeheartedly, put away forever the idols your ancestors worshipped when they lived beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Serve the Lord alone, because God has been giving you so much grace. Serve the Lord, serve him wholeheartedly. And then Joshua challenges them with a choice. And this is where we intersect with the weekend message. He says this, if you refuse to serve the Lord, then choose today whom you will serve. Would you prefer the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or will it be the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live? But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And he's given them a choice. Choose today, in light of all this history, in light of all this grace, in light of where we're standing here today, who are you going to choose to serve? And he challenges them to serve the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, you do what you want, but me and my family, we're going to serve the Lord.
I think what's really interesting about that, what kind of like strikes me at the end of this book here, is they say like, we too will serve the Lord, right? Like he is our God. They choose to renew the covenant in that moment, and immediately Joshua warns them, like, you will not be able to worship the Lord.
It's interesting. He pushes back on him.
Yeah. He's like,
this.
you don't quite know what you're dealing with, right? God is holy. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and sins. Like if you abandon him to worship foreign gods, he will turn against you, harm you, and completely destroy you. And they're like, no, we'll do it. They're not going to do it, but they think they are in this moment.
And you are. He says you're not able to serve the Lord, and he says, no, we are.
Yeah,
it's an interesting pushback.
It's an interesting pushback, and then he even like as he sets up this another stone, as like another memorial stone in this moment, he calls it a witness against them. That when they look back on this, they can't say that God was not faithful, right? That God was faithful. It was them who failed to be faithful. And I think it really sets up this need and kind of the driving focus of the story, that has been the driving focus to this point, but it continues to be the driving focus, is this need for the one who will be faithful, the one who will come and uphold the law in its entirety and be that representative that Israel was always supposed to be, which is the person of Jesus, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the book ends with all the leaders of Israel passing away, of that generation. And then you're left with these questions. Will the Israelites keep their commitments? That said, yes, we will follow the Lord, Will the Israelites, will they have learned their lessons? Did the baton of faith get passed down to the next generation or not? And then comes the book of Judges.
Mm-hmm. No.
It seems like that's the case. Yes.
Yeah. So any other additional thoughts from this weekend's message, or maybe even from this kind of series as a whole as we wrap up here?
Oh, no, I think I'm just encouraged that of this better covenant that we're in, that we've been given better promises. And these and God will be faithful to these better promises. And even though the Israelites seem to sputter and fall, even after seeing everything that God has done for them and all the grace that God has given them, that we will see a better Israelite arise in the future, named Jesus, who is completely faithful, completely obedient, and obeys for us and completely satisfies the demands of the law and steps in for us and obeys for us, that we're counted righteous. And we get to enjoy that Jesus obedience. And boy, that ought to inspire us to be wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, amen. Yeah, I've just been thinking about like the importance of leadership and setting that example for yourself, that like kind of personal obedience. I'm going to make this decision for myself. I'm going to be wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord. Um, what despite whatever else is going on, and the importance of having that in leadership in a church, in the home. This is what Spencer was really talking about. Like, fathers, set the example, go out, be the leader, have that personal devotion like Caleb did, so that it becomes a blessing to the rest of your family. And I think this really gets highlighted with Joshua, and where the rest of the story goes is, when there's a good leader in place, right? We have the ultimate leader in Jesus, so that we can all personally follow. But when we have good leaders in the church and in homes, good things happen.
Yep.
And so I'm super thankful just for the leadership that we have here as a church, of, the faithfulness of you and the rest of the pastors. And we just had the pastor summit last week, where we had pastors from all different regions come in. And so being around this group of just faithful men who've been doing it for a very long time, and a big focus of the pastor summit was on discipleship, of building up the next generation of leaders, and why that's so important, because we see that at the end of this book, right? Joshua passes away, and the rest of the leaders, right? And Israel immediately loses their faithfulness. And we see that it's going to just continue throughout their history. They have a good leader rise up. Once they're gone, the people turn away and fall away again. And it just happens over and over and again. And now we have this rock that we can continually turn to, right? But especially in our church context, of raising up new leaders, having that next generation ready to go, so that when the old leaders it's their time to step away, the church doesn't fall apart. And so that's in ministry, that's in families, that's in the church as a whole. That's such an important thing.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all we got, I think, unless you have any last thoughts.
Nope. It was a nice journey.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking it with me, Jesse.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts. Thank you guys for joining us on this journey through the book of Joshua. It's been a really fun series. It's been a really fun podcast conversation. Hope it's been a blessing to you. We'll be back soon. I don't know exactly when the next episode is, but probably within the next few weeks, we'll get out that Italy update for you guys. But until then, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.